I'm going to share with you everything I wish I knew about annealing and how it relates to metal hardness when I got started working with metals. So when you work with metals, the structure of the metal changes. So we're going to get into a little science, but not too much. When you look through the Fire Mountain Gems and Beads catalog or online and you're new to working with metal, you might notice terminology like dead soft metal, half hard metal, full hard. There's even spring hard. So all metals have a different degree of hardness depending on how they're made and how you receive them. So half hard is what you would use for wire wrapping, for instance, because you want metal that's still soft and can be formed into different shapes but still hold its shape. But full hard is something that you might just be cutting and not really manipulating very much. So when I say spring hard, think of things like memory wire. That's metal that generally will retain the shape that it's in when you start working with it. It springs back to its original shape. Anytime you anneal, you just pretty much want to stick with dead soft metal, because annealing is softening metal. So the science of that is that metal comes in a crystallized molecular form. And the molecules come together in different structures, and the harder it is, the more tight or tense those molecules are. Annealing is using heat as a process to relax those molecules again and bring metal back to a half-hard state. So if you're going to be bending, forming, twisting, or texturing your metal, you don't generally want to start with dead soft, because that's what the state is going to be after you anneal anyway. And we do it through heat. So we're going to talk about how we get to the state we need to anneal at. When you buy your metal, whether it's wire or it's a pre-cut component like a disc or even metal sheets, you're going to get them, and they should come with a protective cover to keep them from scratching, because we don't know how you're going to work with it. But you might be working with silver or copper or jeweler's bronze. And there's different gauges, and that's the thickness of the metal. So a thicker metal is going to feel soft or stiffer even if it's dead soft. Okay? So you need to think about how much manipulation you're going to do and how thick the metal needs to be when you complete your finished project. So when we set the metal aside and we remove our cover, I'm obviously going to do something that takes dead soft metal, which is pretty flexible. Again, if this was a thinner gauge, which is usually a higher number, is a thinner gauge of metal, it's going to bend very easy. But when I work with it through forming or shaping or texturing, it's going to get very stiff. So this is 26 gauge metal here. I don't want to bend it too much, but you see it's got a good degree of flex, okay? So let's go ahead and take a bench block. And a bench block is a metal block that we're going to hammer on. Now this one I like because it's already got a deadening, a sound deadening quality already built in with a layer of rubber. You can also use a rubber block or a sandbag to help reduce the sound when you hammer. Now you can use all kinds of tools to get different shapes and textures in your metal. I have a couple of my favorite hammers right here. This is a chasing hammer. So if you like that hammered metal look, which is usually kind of a dimpled look, this has a nice rounded surface on it that I like to use. But one of my favorite tools is this adjustable head hammer, because it comes with several different heads. They're interchangeable. All you need to do is just unscrew one end and you screw in the head of your choice. And you see I have some heads lying out here now. So this is a really good economical choice for people who are just starting out. Or maybe you have a very limited space to create in and you don't have room for all different types of hammers. So this is a really favorite of mine. But I've gone ahead and picked a texture I think I'm going to like. And I'm not going to bore you with texturing a whole sheet of metal, just so you get the idea. And I'm going to put on my glasses. It's always a good idea to wear safety glasses if you don't wear readers or have prescription glasses to start with. I usually work back away from my piece, but I don't intend to hammer myself, and you shouldn't either. So we're just going to do a little bit of hammering, and I'm going to use some pressure. So when you hammer, you always want to grip it towards the back so you get a lot more force. If you're holding it too close to the front, you're not going to get as much texture as you maybe like to start with. So let's just texture a little bit of this metal right here. Now, Obviously, I'm going to texture until I like the overall surface effect that I achieve. Maybe I don't want every inch of that metal to be textured. Maybe I just want a light scattering of texture that I'm working with here on my hammer. I'm going to texture a little bit more. But the more you bend metal or work it, hammer it, shape it, the stiffer it gets. Okay, that's about enough of that. So this is the technique known as work hardening. It's any of those things I just mentioned where we bend, form, shape our metal. Now work hardening, what that does is it changes the crystalline structure of the molecules of metal. It takes the ones that were relaxed in our dead soft metal and it puts them into a harder state. The more I work it, the stiffer and harder my metal's going to be, which is really good for some types of forming because we want it to retain its shape. But when metal is work hardened to its hardest degree, it also becomes brittle. And you might even have noticed when you did that it got very hot to the touch. You're speeding up the arrangement of the molecules and that introduces heat into it. It's not going to burn you or anything if you pick up your textured piece, but it's really important to note that once we've annealed it, if I'm going to cut it, shape it, dap it, whatever I'm going to do to this, I'm probably going to want to anneal it again. So this bit is much stiffer now than this end here, okay? So I've already done some metal that I've already textured, and this was pickled. We're going to do that in another video. So if you don't know what pickle is, and I'm not talking about the pickle you put on your sandwich, that's about cleaning fire scale for metal. Be sure to check out my video on that. But back to annealing. So what we want to have is in our work area, we're going to work with a fire brick. Now, this fire brick that you can get through Fire Mountain Gems and Beads is my absolute favorite. I use this for working with torch-fired metal clay and when I do soldering, and I love it because it's nice and light, and I travel with my tools, but even if you don't, it's nice and compact, and more importantly, it's not going to transfer a great amount of heat to the underside. So theoretically, I could do this with my blocks sitting on paper. I don't recommend that, but you don't need to worry about too much heat transference through the bottom. Do be mindful though that after you've torched, the surface can remain pretty hot for some time. So for safety's sake, please don't touch the surface and just set your block safely away. But I've gone ahead and I've textured a piece of metal ahead of time, and it's really stiff. If I tried to bend it, it probably wouldn't break the first time, but if I bended it back and forth, it's probably going to crack because it's pretty brittle in this state. And you can get different torches here at Fire Mountain Gems and Beads. This one's a little intense for my liking. I have a lot of control, and for today's purposes, I'm going to use the smaller torch. We can get plenty of annealing done with this torch. Now this torch has a 3-step system, but before we do that, let's talk very briefly about safety because it's really critical. You should always secure any loose hair in clothing. That's just good common sense, of course. But when I work with the torch, I stand behind my torch, well behind my torch, and I also work with my torch at a 45 or 90 or 45 degree angle, not 90. You want to hold your torch and be well behind it. So even if you were to lean and look at what you're doing, you're out of the range of the heat of the torch. The other reason you want to work with your torch at a 45 degree angle is that if you torch like this, and maybe some of you have experienced it, your flame tends to extinguish. And that's because you're not getting enough oxygen exchange for the torch to continue burning. So get in the habit of working at an angle for safety's sake, and you'll also find that that just becomes second nature, whether you're torch firing metal clay or annealing hardened metal. So this torch, there's a safety switch down behind here. So you're going to pull that down, and while you hold it down, you're going to push the ignition, and it might take a couple of presses for that to do that. If I were to release the button, it would go out. But by pushing in this lever here, it locks and stays on. Now, you may also want to consider, if you're not wearing glasses when you work, putting on some safety glasses. Again, if you practice good torching technique, you're not going to be in the danger zone of your flame. Now, the hottest part of the flame, and that's what we want to use, is the sharp blue tip. So all of these torches have a little adjustment there. So you see how that changed, and you even hear a change in how it hisses. It's a little softer, bushier flame, We want that sharp, hissy flame. So if there's any way to bring down the lights or work in a dim room, you don't have to be in a darkened room, you're going to start going over your metal, and having less light will help. Let me see if I can shade this a little bit. But you might start seeing the color change in your piece. So you see how it's getting lighter? In a darker room, it's going to be cherry red. So you see how the color is changing on there? And I'm chasing that color. And as I chase the color, I'm knowing that I'm annealing it. But it's easier if you're working in a dark room. You're going to get that cherry red. Usually one pass is sufficient, but I tend to go over it a couple of times. Now as you do this, your metal's going to get darker. Whether it's silver or jeweler's bronze or copper, it's going to get darker, and that is oxidation and fire scale occurring on your piece. Now to turn off our torch, we're just going to go ahead and press the ignition. Always set your torch safely away, because this tip stays very hot for quite some time. Don't set it to your right or your left, because we don't want to bump our elbow or arm into it. And just give it plenty of time to cool down. Now we're going to quench the metal. Right now, metal cools very quickly, but you don't want to risk touching it. Even though it cools quickly, we want to quench it and do that immediately. So I'm reaching over here, and you want to work with a glass or ceramic dish, not plastic or paper, because even though it cools down in 1 quick second, you don't want it to hit the bottom of something that can burn or melt before it has a chance to do it. And I like my quenching bowl nice and close, and I use tweezers. I like the pointed tweezers because it's a little bit easier to get under and control my metal. Drop it like it's hot. I know that was bad, wasn't it? You can just fish it right out. You hear that little hiss? It's nice and cool. So we're going to take our piece and we're just going to dry it off real quickly and take a look at what we have. Now, to get it back to a little bit of its original color state, it's going to be dull. It's not going to be pretty and shiny. We're going to set that there. You can see how soft it is. Okay, it's been annealed. So it's ready for me. It's going to be easier to cut. It's going to be easier to bend. It's going to be easier to shape my metal. But to get rid of that fire scale, we need to pickle. And that's not just something you put on your sandwich. So if you don't know about pickling, be sure to check out my video on how to pickle your metal, which is just another way of saying we're removing the fire scale. And that's about it.